to give you some context really to my research, I am a director of Lucidus Consulting. I spend my time as an organisational change consultant and managing director of that firm. And I work with all sorts of organisations across multiple sectors, and all my work is really helping them with their planned change challenges. So you can see coming up here some of the organisations who I'm working with. Some of them are thinking about planned change because they're doing major capital investments in new facilities. Some of them deliver their core product or service to their clients in a sort of project mode, and others are doing major internal transformations of culture and behaviour. So all sorts of intended changes, changes that are intended by those organisations to create value. And obviously this is, core work for most organisations across sectors. So why did I believe that planned change needed to be researched further, given that there is actually a huge literature already, both an academic literature and practitioner literature, and some pretty famous academics who've had sensible things to say. So most of you probably have come across, Kurt Levine's work and his change model. John Cotter is, one example of academics who've, written extensively about planned change, in airport-type books as well as academic articles. And there's lots of practical guidance that comes through professional bodies, whether that's from a project management point of view or from a wider organisational development, organisational behaviour view. I guess what one of the views that's around, and I guess the view that I ascribe to, that much of the advice that's out there is quite prescription-like, do this and all will be well. And despite this sort of plethora of advice, organisations of all sizes struggle to realise the benefits that they want from their investment in change. So I was really motivated to understand some more about that. And of course there are many angles that could have been pursued. But what I wanted to do was just really start with what I call the core planned change paradigm and work from there. And the picture that you see there is sort of my articulation of that core paradigm, which really says that if we want to bring about change in an organisation, then actually forming some sort of temporary organisation, whether we call it a project team or an initiative or some other term, but a temporary organisation where change agents will be responsible for bringing about planned change to the routine work of the organisation. So you've got the people who are actually doing the work in the organisation, you could call those change recipients. And there's a literature, quite an extensive academic literature about boundary spanning, about spanning the boundary between the temporary and the host organisations and tensions across that. So I was really starting from there, and what I discovered was that lots of the literature tended to adopt a very change agent-centric view. A lot of the advice is about, what change agents in temporary organisations should do, might do, ought to do to bring about change. And there was much less about change recipients, about the people whose work and their associate behaviours were intended to change. What I wanted to do was to research planned change from the perspective of change recipients, but I didn't want to, almost flip it and go from a change agent-centric view to a change recipient-centric view. So I was really looking for an angle, a theoretical perspective that would allow me to embrace the whole temporary and host organisational system. And so a lot of my work, particularly in the first year of my DBA, was about finding that theoretical angle, which is obviously essential if you're going to do a doctorate, and then to think how to operationalise that so I could come up with a research method that I could take to practice and really try and find some insights. 5 years later, seems like maybe too much of a fast forward, but my work really has focused in on researching the internal dynamics of organisational routines undergoing plan change using a practice perspective. And you might say, you know, how did she get from where she started to all of those words? But where we were looking at the core plan change paradigm and the relationship between the temporary and the host organisation, what I did was take that system as a whole and to say, I wanted to look inside using the organisational routine as proxy for the work that was intended to change, and really look inside that routine undergoing change, what change agents, change recipients and their line managers thought about it and did about it, and the whole interaction between those. So you can see the picture on the screen. Drawing on literature encouraged me to look at, on the left-hand side, the routine undergoing change in principle, so how people really thought and felt and intended to act when performing the routine undergoing change, and the relationship between that routine and principle and what people actually did in practice, and therefore the outcomes that were created from that. And my research then built a new theoretical model of how people working on routines undergoing change behave, and I explored it through to in-depth case studies. And so I really learned lots about the value of the textbook approaches, if you could call them those, or the prescriptions, and how those strategies are they're not wrong, but they're not sufficient to craft meaningful and lasting change and business results. And very specifically, here are some of the things that I learned. So apologies for lots of words on the slide. So as I've already said, you know, the change agent-centric viewpoint, you know, my findings suggested were insufficient, that if we really wanted to understand how plan change was accomplished in practice, then not only change agents but change recipients and their line managers needed to be considered. And as part of that, and you might find this in your own work, that it's really easy to talk about people being stakeholders or users or recipients in an instrumental way, and really not getting under the skin of that in terms of in appreciating underlying attitudes to change of all parties. You know, particularly a change agent-centric view sort of takes the notion of resistance to change and almost positions that as being somehow illogical or illegitimate. And what I wanted to do in my research was to really go beyond that and to say, during this plan change, whether the people were in the change team or were doing roles that were intended to change, what were the underlying attitudes to change of all the parties, and how you know, did that affect you know, beliefs and intentions and actions. I discovered that through my case studies that you know, dialogue and narrative you know, obviously has a huge part to play, and that successful change is crafted from that dialogue and people thinking together, and that's sometimes quite messy, and that people employed as change agents don't automatically or are not necessarily trained to have the skills to stay in maybe what is quite a difficult place with greater persistence, and to have a range of behavioural approaches to deal with whatever they're finding. And particularly, you know, there are some conflicts that need to be held in plan change between being empathetic to perhaps the perspectives of people who don't want things to change or who are struggling with the change, so that conflict between being empathetic but being distant enough to drive things forward, conflicts between being courteous and understanding yet persuasive and intentional. And one of the specific things that I learned through my research, and that I'm actually continuing to write about in a conference paper at the moment, and I think there's an interesting area of further research, is about how the nature of the planned change actually warrants different choices of change agents. Not necessarily in terms of skill, but in terms of how close those change agents are to the routine that needs to be changed. And there's some really interesting emergent findings about that I think it will be interesting to take forward. So lots of words there. This poster is a fairly simplistic picture, really, of what we've sort of branded as all in this together and plan change beyond prescriptions, which is really what my research was about. On the top right there, that what I was really interested in is an understanding how what it takes to change how the day job is done, if you like, and really some new thinking coming out from that about the interaction between change agents and change recipients. It all sounds, I think, probably quite obvious and easy when it's presented like this, and people said to me all the way through my doctorate, what's your doctorate about? And when you finished, will we just go, oh yeah, that's obvious? And I sort of feel a bit like that at this point, but without getting into the sort of the deep theoretical aspects of it on this webinar, which would be completely boring and inappropriate for you. But what I did want to share was that actually, although my findings are really exciting for me, as a practitioner, but actually achieving the academic, overcoming the academic hurdles with this is really the most difficult thing I have done in my life. A doctorate requires the creation of new knowledge, as you probably understand, and that's not new to you, but really new to academe. An executive doctorate requires this and a contribution to practice. And one of the things that I've valued hugely in doing my doctorate at Cranfield is that Cranfield really has got a focus on knowledge into action and encouraged the contribution to practice as much as contribution to knowledge. And just requiring this does require a huge amount of tenacity and resilience, and I would say that one of the things that I've learned the most, or where I've personally developed the most, is being able to really withstand sometimes what felt like quite brutal and bruising feedback from supervisors and examiners. I'm saying this now looking straight into the eyes of one of my supervisory panel, Professor Denia, who will be speaking later. So I think, just in terms of personal development, that development of resilience has been really very worthwhile for me. And, the personal rewards are immense. I think, just how I think, how I write, how I frame an argument to be persuasive. These are all benefits that if you're thinking of doing a doctorate, that might not be the most obvious things, but have been hugely beneficial to me. But I think most importantly for me, I now have unique and powerful new insights into plan change that I can share with my clients to their advantage and mine, obviously, in my management practice. So I think that was about 15 minutes, and that's all I planned to say today, but I think I'm going to be grilled now from David and maybe from you too.
Thank you very much, Ruth, for that. Perhaps if I could ask Professor David Denia to start with the questioning.
Okay. So, afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Ruth. That's a great overview of your work. There's a couple of things I wanted to pick up on, which was you started out with this project as a DBA project, and you had a very clear focus on a business issue that you were interested in.
Yes.
And then your DBA became quite theoretical. You really got quite engaged in the literature, and I just thought maybe you could say a little bit more about that process and about the link between the theory side of things that you really got engaged in and the practical application of it.
Yes, and you're right. I mean, I did come to do a DBA with a very practical issue that I wanted to solve, and why I did a DBA and not a PhD in the first place. And although you know, that I suppose that desire to, you know, get some insights for practice were the start. Probably 3 out of the 5 years that I was working on this, I probably wasn't thinking about that much, because I did approach this in a very theoretical way. I found, just in terms of my personal journey, I mean, I just found it absolutely just really compelling to, you know, get into the theoretical literature and to try and find an angle on that, and I really enjoyed that. And I think, you know, there were times in my panel meetings where, you know, almost, I guess some of the advice that we got from some of the lecturers was, you know, this is a doctorate, you do need to make a contribution to knowledge, and maybe the tendency of some of the DBAs was to want to stick with practice all the time. You know, don't forget, we're doing a DBA, we want to make a contribution to practice, which I absolutely did, but we're really encouraged that this is, you know, this is an academic award, and that we needed to make a contribution to knowledge. And I think, you know, some of you felt that I was taking that maybe a bit seriously, a bit too seriously at time, but I was just really, really interested in that. And I think that, you know, one of the things that I found difficult was then almost when the contribution to knowledge was made, is almost in drawing that back up again, and that was quite challenging to do. But I feel now that it's really good that now I'm, you know, back in practice and thinking about the implications of my theoretical contribution for practice, that's just been a hugely worthwhile thing for me to do.
One of the things that you mentioned in your presentation but didn't really elaborate on is the notion of routines.
Yeah.
You mentioned the word a few times but didn't get, and I thought from your work one of the real core elements of the work was this focus on the routine, which a lot of people don't do. They often focus on individual attitudes towards change, individual behaviours, or let's change the systems, the processes, the structures. And I think the focus on the routine as a repetitive set of actions that people are undergoing, it's their practices that are currently there, and let's change that repetitive set of practices is really quite a nice way of thinking about, well, a different way of thinking about change. It's a different way of thinking about what's the focus of change. So just
talk some more about that.
Say a little bit more about the notion.
Was that too eager to think people might be bored by
Well,
that?
I don't. Because I actually think this is quite a central part of your work.
Yeah, it
but
is.
Also, I think it does give people something different to think about. You know, repetitive pattern of action. Let's change that. Everyone in their daily lives has a set of routines, and a lot of organisational life is routinized. So everything we do, the way that we run meetings, the way that we might say do a recruitment interview, there's probably a Cranfield way of doing that, you know, and that's a routine that's developed over time. Now, we often think about let's change the attitudes, let's change the systems, the processes. We don't often thinking about, well, let's change the routines.
Well, okay, so permission to talk about routines a bit. And the first thing to say, I think, is that, my work absolutely focused on, you know, the unit of analysis was the organisational routine undergoing planned change. And organisational routines are, I think when I've used that word with practitioners, they say, oh, you mean the process, or, oh, you know, and some subset of routine. So routine in the academic literature refers to the whole set of practices, you know, thoughts, feelings, behaviours, systems, the context, you know, everything that's associated with actually carrying out some sort of repetitive activity, not really at a task level, but in terms of accomplishing an outcome. And a lot of the research on organisational routines hitherto has been about the role of the routine in providing stability and reliability in organisations. So routines are really important in our organisations so we can be consistent, we can get consistent products, services, so we can build quality in, etc. And there was, and sometimes some of the routines literature has looked at routines as a thing, almost as a black box. But from a practice perspective, some researchers, and Martha Feldman and Brian Pentland particularly, have looked at sort of opening up this black box and looking at the internal dynamics and the relationships, the very reciprocal and recurrent relationships that are going on between the multiple people performing this routine over time. So what I wanted to do was have a unit of analysis that allowed me to look at everything from what change, a particular change recipient or a number of change recipients were thinking about the change, at the same time as what change agents were perhaps doing, at the same time as the particular, some of the more external contextual factors that were going on outside of the routine in the organisation. And the organisational routine as a unit of analysis was almost the wrapper where I could look at all sorts of micro and macro contextual factors that were involved with multiple interdependent actors undergoing this recurrent activity. And what was quite interesting in looking at plan change to organisational routines is that routines are intended to be cyclical, whereas so much of the plan change literature sees plan change as being linear. And so you actually get this really interesting sort of different perspectives of time between a linear change process, or even in programs what is seen as maybe a more cyclical change process, but somehow superimposing that on the cyclical nature of the work to be changed. So, finding a way to study that was quite challenging, but I think I found quite a practical way to do that. Just
for our listeners, what would be an example of a routine?
Yeah, okay. So one of the routines that I researched was a routine of this is in a projectized organisation, and the routines associated with preparing for gate reviews and getting funding to move to the next stage of the development of a project. So that routine, so it's not an action of an individual person. There were multiple actors involved in that, but the purpose of the routine was to either get a go or a no-go of a decision gate to move on to the next stage. So that was one of the routines that I researched.
In terms of the notion of the routines and the plan change, does this change our sort of, you talked about some of our existing ways of thinking about change. You talked about Cotter and Lewin and others, and this notion of unfreeze, change, refreeze.
Yeah.
It sounds to me that if we're undergoing plan change, we ought to really spend more time understanding the initial phase and the routines that they're at the start.
Yeah.
And it's not just about sort of unfreezing, but it's actually understanding that those
Absolutely.
routines are actually a dynamic at that stage and not so much frozen to start with.
Well, and I think that is really interesting, and in contrasting plan change with more sort of evolutionary continuous improvement, there is a view to say that actually to change something, there needs to be a common understanding to start with. So absolutely, in one of my case studies, which actually was a case of 4 years of plan change effort that resulted in no change, that resulted in stability, one of the things that I found was that the routine in the first place wasn't frozen enough for there to be a common enough understanding of it to then build from. So, the unfreeze, change, refreeze, yes, does assume that something's frozen in the first place, and often what we're trying to do is change things that are not, maybe frozen's not the right, but is not understood well enough, then to be able to get any sort of collective impetus behind change, and that was certainly one of the findings from my first case.
Can I go back to a point that you made earlier about sort of the starting point for your work and the PhD DBA, and so when did you first think about doing a doctorate, and then what was the choice of PhD DBA? Maybe go back to that question.
Well, I'd never considered doing a doctorate really until I was doing some work with academics at Cranfield for another reason, and it was two things really. One was because I worked for Cranfield, people used to assume I was a doctor, so call me Dr. Murray-Webster, and I used to have to explain that I wasn't. And then someone saying to me, well, you could do a doctorate, and I said, don't be daft, you know, I don't want to do that. And I really wasn't at that time interested in doing anything theoretical, but when I heard about the DBA, I'd done an MBA before a number of years ago, 15 years ago, and when I heard about the DBA and the Cranfield DBA, and that I suppose I'd heard things about DBAs that they were sort of second-rate doctorates, and when I looked into Cranfield's DBA and saw absolutely that wasn't the case, and almost that there is a dual hurdle of, you know, theory and practice, and that I could start in practice, then that was really compelling, because I wasn't starting with any theoretical thing. I just have my work. The other thing was that I'd never intended to be a full-time academic, and still don't intend to be, so it wasn't that I needed to get a PhD to put a tick in any sort of box. But I wanted to, the other thing, I was bored with what I was doing, and I knew that the prescriptions didn't work, and I want to work for a bit longer, and I felt I needed something to dine out on.
Just interesting around the impact of your work, and I think often we think about doing a piece of work and then having impact. Did you find that it was having an impact on your work and how you work with organisations, impact on
absolutely
as you went through the process?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the major benefits came within a year of starting. I mean, I learned to read and write completely differently in the first year. You know, just that sort of critical thinking, you know, being able to frame an argument, and starting to just, as I was reading the literature, you know, because I was working with organisations doing plan changes all the time, so it's just this continual sort of synthesis of ideas that was going on, so really quite a messy and iterative process. And so yeah, the you know, it's a bit of a cliche, you know, to say the journey's as good as the outcome, but absolutely my learning was continual, and you know, my graduation tomorrow will be very nice, but yeah, the benefits came actually quite a few years ago, I would say.
And are you still seeing that now, that you're using that work to have an impact?
Absolutely, yeah. And what I'm really interested in now is thinking about how my research method, which, you know, was very although the theoretical basis was really very detailed, as you know, my actual research method in terms of how I collected data was really quite practical. And what I'm really interested in for practice is how the research method that I used retrospectively to collect data from my research, I can potentially use prospectively, or organisations can use prospectively to help them understand the change context better before launching into sort of crafting, shaping plan change action.
And were those the kind of outcomes that you had at the start?
No.
Or what you thought you expected, the impact?
I had no clue
at the
start. No, I just had an itch at the start.
So
yeah, I just knew there was a problem. I had no clue what might come out of it. No, just not a clue.
Okay. What about next steps? Where you're taking this next in terms of the practical application?
Okay.
So you're thinking.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, just from from an academic point of view, so I do have a paper that's at a conference in the summer, and that's been accepted into a sub-theme that has the potential of getting into a special issue of organisational studies, which I always said at the start I wanted to graduate and get a 4-star journal paper, and I didn't quite believe it, but it sort of might be possible. And there are lots of areas where but I guess I have to say, if I carve out the time, that there's places to go in terms of academic papers and publications. But in terms of my, I think I'm more focused now on my practical work and on really helping, you know, organisations get some benefit from the work that I've done. So a lot of the work that I've done in the last couple of months, once my thesis was signed off and I started thinking about big words, is now trying to translate that into stuff that I can talk to clients about that they can engage with.
And what's that process like? I mean, are you using social media? Are you turning it into a set of tools and rules?
Well, it's really interesting. You see, I mean, I'm saying this is beyond prescription, so I would be completely untrue to everything that I've found to turn it into a new set of rules and guides. That's what I'm arguing shouldn't happen. So far I'm just working with specific clients and finding ways to help them get benefit from this. I've written a few books on other topics already, and I'm not considering a book, but yeah, I tweet, I blog, and there are little insights from it that, you know, something will happen with a client or in the media and it reminds me of something that I learned, and so I'm just trying to be sort of out there as much as I can with a general message, but really my main focus is with particular clients and helping them get value from it.
Great. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, David, and thank you, Ruth, again. Okay, what I'd like to do now is just spend a few minutes, and Ruth has actually touched on a lot of the points that I want to make, so that's very helpful, thank you. But just spend a few minutes talking about the DBA programme itself, and really what the main characteristics of that programme are. So as you will have gathered from the conversation that David and Ruth were having, the DBA is all about impact. So why people join us to do a PhD, generally because they want to move into a full-time academic career. For people that join us to do a DBA or our International Executive Doctorate, it's really about wanting to have an impact on both their own organisation, their own business, and on wider policy and practice. So the DBA is really designed for people that want to do something that's got practical relevance. And that's the main difference, I think, at doctoral level between the PhD and the DBA. But it's not only about impact on practice, it's also about impact on the researchers themselves that come and join us as DBA researchers. And again, as Ruth kindly pointed out, it does have quite a big impact on people in terms of their practice, the way that they approach their thinking and problem solving, if you like. And we do see, probably from about a year into the programme, that people make a really quite a dramatic personal transition to a much more evidence-based, rigorous kind of style of thinking. You know, and they're making, I think, much more reliable and better decisions. And because of this transition, and because they're becoming experts in a particular field, that means that it also has a large impact on their career. In terms of the Cranfield DBA in particular, we realise, I guess, that it's people that come and join us on the DBA are busy people. And they don't have, perhaps in the same way that our full-time PhD students have, they don't have a lot of time, or they struggle to find a lot of time to devote to their doctoral studies. And because of that, we've designed the programme to try and help them, to help people through the programme so that they reach the end successfully, because obviously that's what you want and that's what we want as well. And we've done that by breaking up the doctoral process into some clear milestones, giving it a very distinct structure, and also by offering some very high levels of support. So at Cranfield, you not only get a lead supervisor, as you would with a PhD, who will work through your doctorate with you, but on the DBA you also have a 3-person panel system, so you have 2 other academics who will work with you to support you throughout the system and really to, to help you get to the end successfully, if you like. On top of that support, we also put a lot of emphasis here on the cohort that you work with, and we put you into relatively small cohorts here at Cranfield, normally around 12 students a year, and that's, because you draw a lot of support from each other. So you're put in quite a small cohort, you will do a lot of development and a lot of work together in the talk weeks here at Cranfield, and what that means is that you get peer support, and you also have a member of faculty that's a cohort leader, so comes in and works with you and supports you, both in terms of academic and, I guess, pastoral support to help you through that. So we really do feel that the Cranfield DBA offers you a very high level of support compared to perhaps some other programs. And we found, as we've added to that support structure over the years, that the proportion of our DBA researchers getting through to the end successfully is going up and up, so we're pleased with that structure. And I think partly because of that structure and the support system, we're really pleased that we have accreditation from the Association of MBAs. So I think it's important to realise if you're looking at doing a DBA that there's actually no official DBA rankings out there in the world. There are a few unofficial ones, but the only official accreditation or evaluation of DBA programs is provided by the Association of MBAs. There's currently around 11 programs across the world, so only 11 that are accredited by AMBA, and we were awarded 5 years rather than the normal 3 years, and we think that's a real reflection on the quality of our program, so that's something that we're very proud of and like to shout about. And finally, just to give you, I guess, an overview of what the program looks like structure-wise. So it's a 4-year program, and the first 2 years of the program is really about equipping you with the skills and the knowledge that you need to undertake the piece of research that you're going to do. So you'll see on the slide that hopefully you can see here that there are 8, the dots you can see at the top, there are 8 talk weeks in the first 2 years, and they're really based around the research skills that you need. And then years 3 and 4 are really about you doing your own research with some in-depth workshops that you can attend if you need some extra support in terms of particular methodologies. And then we would bring you back for a short week in the final year to give you some thesis preparation and Viva support. You can see also on this diagram that the thesis that you write is divided into 7 deliverables, and they're the rectangular blue blocks that you can see there. And as I said, we've split this up into these building blocks, if you like, of the thesis to make it easier for you to get through the process. The one other thing that I'd like to point out on this diagram is that yellow arrow, if you can see that. Because what we also do on the DBA is that we encourage you to engage and talk to people in practitioner roles that will effectively be the end users of your research throughout the research process. And this is to make sure that what you come out with at the end really is relevant to practice and really does have that impact that we keep talking about on practice, and you can take something that's useful away with you at the end of that process. Okay, so after that taste of the DBA process, we're going to turn it over to you to ask some questions. So if you do want to ask a question, if you can either put your hand up, and then I will come to you and you can unmute and speak, or you can type the questions into the text box at the bottom, and I will, to either myself or to a host, and I will read them out for either myself, obviously, Professor Denya next to me, or to Ruth. So, over to you. Any questions? Ruth, have you got any questions in your chat?
Yes, so I've got a couple of questions here already. I think one of them just pick up on maybe something that David asked me about. Could I recommend 2 or 3 ways of disseminating my research? You know, what would I recommend? So between practitioner events or social media or lobbying key influencers. I think, you know, as I said before, it's not been that long since I finished, and I tended to focus really the benefits of my research for practice on the client assignments that I'm carrying out. But I think there are a number of things, including those that were listed there. A lot of the professional bodies, things like CIPDs, Chartered Institute of Professional Personnel and Development, or the Association for Project Management in the UK, and others, all run practitioner events that they're always really willing for speakers. At the moment, because I don't want to, I'm not trying to build a new prescription. I think it's really, really important from my work. Then, what I'm trying to do is just build that awareness of with the people that I'm working with, and with people who follow my Twitter feed and follow my blog, as to some of the insights from that. So I guess it depends as well what sort of a person you are and how much you want to engage with social media, etc. But there are lots of different ways, and I know some of the other people who were in my DBA cohort have written books already and had those published with their research.
What is your Twitter name and blog name, so people might want
Oh, right, okay, so, yeah, I think I'm just R. Murray-Webster, my Twitter name, and, yeah, my blog's on my website, which is www.ruthmurray-webster.com. Thank you. You can also look at lucidusconsulting.com, which is my company's website, if you want to do that also. That would be very nice. Thank you.
Okay, I have a couple of questions about the programme from Emily. So she is asking, she's got a few questions, some of which I tried to answer in the presentation that I gave. So I'll just pick out the ones that I don't think I've answered. She says, are there any high-profile examples of people that have done a Cranfield DBA? Well, the obvious one, I guess, to mention would be Andy Wood, who is the CEO of Adnams Brewery, for those beer fans out there. He's relatively high-profile, was awarded an OBE in the honours list last year. And also Dr. Alice Maynard, who those of you that are involved in the kind of disability agenda will know her name. She's done quite a lot of work in the UK around kind of disability policy and such like, and a lot of that is based on her DBA. And a few that are working on it, I think it would be fair to say. So. All right, other questions from Emily. Emily says, what would you say attracts people to study at Cranfield? I think that might be a better question for Ruth, actually, and then perhaps I can pick up on that if necessary, as someone that was attracted to study.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that, I was a little bit different because I had contacts here anyway and was working here, and so sort of knew a little bit about the organisation. But maybe I can talk about other people in my cohort and what attracted them. And I think that, Cranfield has got a really strong brand, not only in the UK but internationally, and particularly for its DBA programme. And a number of people in my cohort, people who had, huge jobs in corporations from overseas, came to Cranfield to do a DBA because they wanted to do the highest level degree possible, but wanted to do something that was going to be relevant to their work, that was really going to be relevant to their work. And I noticed actually, someone had asked a question about, do people do DBAs for the same reasons, e.g. promotion, and I would say people do DBAs for a whole host of reasons, and I think promotion is probably not something that anybody's ever said to me. Of the people that I've worked with here at Cranfield, people are doing DBAs because they've reached a stage in their career where they've got a real thirst for understanding how things can be better, have got a real thirst for knowing more and being able to do more, and that would be my observation. Emily's asked if I studied the DBA again, would I do anything differently? And she said, have I got any friends and family? I do have friends and family. I still have friends and family as a result of this. I guess the only thing that I would say, I don't think I would do anything differently, although my DBA had periods of intense activity and then some long periods of frustration and stagnation and kicking the cat if I had one and stamping my feet and saying I wasn't going to finish. So it was messy. And I would say if you don't ever come into it thinking it'll be plain sailing, because it is difficult, but it's really worthwhile. And did I give up a lot of time with friends and family? I just carved the time out. I mean, I obviously work for my own company, so I just saw my DBA was just another client assignment in that respect. I just built it into my work week, but I was working 60, 70 hours a week some of the time, and sometimes I wasn't. And actually some of my best insights I had on holiday, where I was up at 5 a.m. and reading papers, as the sun was coming up in some lovely place and my family was still asleep, so they didn't even know I was doing it.
I think it's important to realise, for those of you that are considering embarking on a DBA, that it is not an easy journey. I mean, we do talk about it needing 15 to 20 hours a week of work. That's not a level 15 to 20 hours. There will be some weeks when it will be considerably more than that, some weeks when it may be less than that. And it is a big commitment, and it does eat into your life. It's not something, perhaps if you've done master's degrees or MBAs, and sometimes you can spend a few hours at the weekend knocking out an assignment. The difference with a doctorate is it takes a lot of reflection time, and really is, it is a big commitment, and I think it's important for anyone to realise that. But I think it's also important to realise that in terms of listening to Ruth's story, and I know from working with other DBA researchers here that it is worth it in terms of the transition that you have and the impact that it has both on you and your career.
I've got a question for Ruth, which is, you mentioned cohorts a couple of times.
Oh, yeah.
How valuable was that to you, having that kind of a group of peers going through the same process, and who were they?
Okay, so in the first year, it was really, really valuable. So there was, I think, 12 of us started. I think we became 10 fairly quickly. 2 dropped out fairly quickly, but then the rest of us, still stick together. And I would say I've made some firm friends out of my cohort. And in the first year, we were really close. And part of that was because we were at Cranfield a lot. We were studying together. We were all really sort of tussling with some of the same issues. And then as we got further into our own research, we had less, I suppose, in common, because we were all doing our own thing, but we found that we were a real source of support, and certainly there are 5 or 6 people who I still talk to regularly. And also the cohort was invaluable, that although we were all researching different things, the process of research was the same for all of us. So cohorts are great for bitching about your supervisor or your supervisory panel, or just how do you get over this, or this is happening to me, or that's happening to me too. That's all really, really invaluable. And in my cohort, there was a whole range of people, from people who were very, very senior in banking, some people working in academia, people working in pharma development, people working in HR, just a whole range of people internationally, and great networking and some firm friends.
There's a question here from Martin Price that says, managing plan change in organisations tends to be promoted as a repetitive activity or prescription, e.g. COTA. Is there a paradigm here where we habitually seek a formula to follow? Could it be that change agents need to respect the becoming and be open to more exploratory approaches?
Well, yeah, I would absolutely say so, yes. But and that is at the heart of it. But I think what's really interesting in Martin's observation there is that I absolutely would say that if we're going to accomplish plan change, then more you know, more, whether you call it flexibility, adaptability, open mind, you know, willingness to, you know, to just, you know, struggle and debate and change and, you know, change yourself and change your approach is absolutely fundamental. But that we should recognise that actually business out there is looking for prescriptions. It's looking for rules to follow.
There's something comforting in that as well.
There's something very comforting in that, and that you know, it's, I think, you know, it would be foolish to almost pretend that we can, you know, we're not going to transform the way that people are thinking about business, and a lot of the ways that people think about businesses is in a very objective and rational way, and therefore objective and rational answers are sought. And so I think one of the, you know, the big challenges in a lot of my work in organisations is helping managers to stay in that more messy place for longer to find the right solutions.
Yeah. It sounds also like there's quite a lot of writing around at the moment on adaptive leadership.
Yeah.
Which is about dealing with these more complex problems where you can't just set the end goal and then work backwards from that with a set of metrics and it's going to be a linear process, and it's about holding people in that productive range where you're kind of holding some of that attention, some of that ambiguity.
And you're holding that space.
If you haven't got that, then sometimes there's not enough stimulus there to actually generate the change in the individual.
And what's really interesting with that is if you're talking about adaptive leadership in a planned change environment where you've got people in change agents in a temporary organisation and change recipients in the host organisation who are themselves leaders, how that adaptive leadership plays out, you know, across that boundary, if you like. You know, so who's doing that, and how are they working together to collectively create the right environment for change to occur?
Yeah, so I think we broadly agree with Martin.
I think we do, yeah.
Okay, just one last question. Actually, it's a couple of questions again from Emily, but they're asking the same question really, so I'll give them to you together, Ruth.
Okay.
Emily's talking about, you talked a little bit, I mentioned the transition, but then you talked a little bit about kind of new skills and approaches that you'd learned as part of the DBA. Basically, Emily's asking for an expansion on that. So one of the questions was, do you learn how to process information quicker or better? And then another question was, what skills do DBA researchers enhance as a result of their studies?
Okay. So, I mean, you're obviously not taught to process things quicker, but it's an outcome. I think, you know, what if I talk about what I suppose the DBA taught me to do, and then how those things that I learned, you know, sort of developed into wider, more generic skills. So, you know, a lot of the things that the DBA teach you to do in the first year is to understand academic literature, and that means reading it, and it's often dense, and you need to get through huge amounts of it. So, and you know, what you are absolutely taught to do is to read that critically and to really draw out, you know, key insights and key points from that. So those skills of analysis and synthesis, I think, are taught and I found have been really the most valuable knock-on skills. You know, we're surrounded by information, whether it's in academic journal articles or whether it's on the internet or whether it's, you know, so being able to just take stuff and process it and synthesize it in a you know, finding connections, I think was partly taught and then emerged from that. And then from there is then when you've got your thinking straight, you've got to write it down again in a way that someone else can understand it. And I think, you know, Rebecca's heard me say before that I believe my writing's got loads better. You know, David might think, well, it's still very woolly, but you should have seen it before. My writing has got loads better, but I would say then it's my writing of whether it's you know, a tweet or a blog posting or a practitioner article or an academic article. So, you know, what I've found is that what I was taught about academic writing, I've been able to just, you know, use in different contexts. So, you know, the skills I've improved, you know, I think better and I write better, I think would be the highlights for me.
Okay. Okay. So that's our time is now up, I'm afraid. So it just remains with me to say thank you very much to Ruth Murray-Webster, Dr. Ruth Murray-Webster, who will officially graduate at our graduation ceremony tomorrow morning, and also to Professor David Denyer for joining us this afternoon to give Ruth a bit of a grilling about her work. And thank you to all of us for joining us. Just to let you know that if you do want further information about the programme, you should now be able to see on the slides our web address. And we are also on Twitter. So you can follow me at Dr. Emma Parry, or you can follow the hashtag Cranfield DBA that's now on your screen. We will be having another webinar on the 2nd of July, and we will have 2 Cranfield DBA alumni there for you there. Dr. Mike McGrath, who graduated quite some time ago now, so he will be able to tell us about his career since the DBA, and also Necca, who will come along to talk about her. She's also graduating tomorrow. Okay, so thank you very much, and goodbye from us.